Joseph Stalin, the self-christened Man of Steel, has been hailed as a saint and a sinner, a communist and a fascist, as a hero of the people and as the most evil man in history. Born into abuse and poverty, permanently disabled at the age of 12, and arrested and exiled no fewer than 6 times by the age of 35, somehow this diminutive poet from Georgia rose to the position of supreme leader of one of the most powerful empires in all of human history, the Soviet Union. But who was this man that so altered the path of history? What was his life like? How did someone from his background ascend to such heights? And is his legacy as the most evil man in history justified? Let's find out. Little So-So, Stalin's early life. Stalin was not Joseph's real name. Decades before anyone would come to hear the name Stalin, Iosif Vissarionovich Djougashvili was born in the little Georgian town of Gori on the 18th of December, 1878. The only one of his parents' children to survive past infancy, Iosif was nicknamed So-So and presumably cherished by his mother Ekaterine and father Bessarion. Soon, however, So-So's life would become marred by turmoil. His father, a shoemaker whose workshop had once provided him a steady income, fell into poverty and alcoholism. When little So-So wasn't taking part in the organized street brawls which passed for sport in the working-class town of Gori, he was subjected to beatings from his drunken father. At the age of 6, little So-So and his mother left their home and Bessarion's abuse behind and lived a transient life. During this time, So-So witnessed a public hanging in the town square, an event which scarred the young boy, and yet one which would ironically come to define his reign of terror as dictator of the Soviet Union. As if So-So's childhood had not been troubled enough, a smallpox infection in 1884 left him facially scarred for life. Then, at the age of 12, he was hit by a passing horse and carriage, an accident which rendered him permanently disabled in his left arm. Perhaps in the trauma of these early years, we can find some root for the devastating violence of Joseph Stalin's later ones. Koba, a teenage Marxist. Despite the instability of his early life, young Stalin was a remarkably bright kid. Rarely out of trouble with authority, he nevertheless excelled at school, proving especially gifted in the arts. He sang in the choir, painted, performed on stage, and wrote his own poetry. As a schoolboy at the Orthodox Gori Church School, So-So demonstrated his flair for the dramatic, his love of attention, and his inherently rebellious nature. In August of 1894, at the age of 15, So-So moved to Georgia's capital city, Tiflis, known now as Tbilisi. There, he attended further schooling at the Orthodox Spiritual Seminary, thanks to a scholarship and the support of wealthy benefactor Yakoby Egnatashvili. It is here, under the tutelage of Orthodox priests, that Stalin would later claim he found and embraced Marxism. At first, teenage So-So achieved high grades and was a good-natured pupil. But after joining a forbidden book club with other pupils, he became more politically minded and distrusting of authority. He found inspiration in Karl Marx's 1867 critique of political economics, Das Kapital. Around this time, So-So dropped his childhood nickname in favor of the fiercer-sounding Koba, a reference to the bandit hero of Alexander Kazbeghi's leftist novel, The Patricide. Koba began putting all of his energy into the study of Marxism. His grades dropped, he stopped showing the seminary monks respect, and at night he would sneak out of his rooms to attend secret workers' meetings held by Georgian Marxists. When Koba left school in 1899, he was already well on his way to becoming one of the most famous communists of all time. Arrest and exile. Stalin's militant years as underground revolutionary. For the now 21-year-old Stalin, however, there was no question as to how Marxism should be practiced. It appears that right from the outset of Kober's revolutionary involvement, he was only concerned with direct, extreme, violent action. He would describe himself later in life as a practical revolutionary, rather than an armchair one. Beginning in 1900, Joseph Stalin, still known as Kober, began giving classes and lectures in socialist theory. Moreover, he put his theory into practice by successfully organizing a number of strikes across Georgia, including a march involving 3,000 workers on May Day 1901, and a mass public demonstration in Batumi, which resulted in the death of 13 protesters. By this time, Kober was already on the watch list of the Russian Empire's secret police, the Okhrana. Thanks to the support of friends, family, and sympathizers, he was able to continue his operations underground. Toward the end of 1901, Kober was elected to the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Then, in 1902, Kober was finally caught by the state secret police and sentenced to 3 years of exile in the bleak, impossibly vast, and terribly cold region of Siberia. This first arrest would mark the beginning of a repeating pattern for the increasingly popular and increasingly extremist Stalin. By the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, he would have been arrested and exiled a further 5 times, including a 4-year stint in the Arctic Circle, which turned him into a hard and cynical man. Russian Revolution roulette, backing the right faction. The feisty Kober managed to escape from his exiles time and time again, and each time he returned to Georgia, he found himself in higher favor with the socialist parties there. By this time, the RSDLP had split into 2 main factions: the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, and the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov. Though the opposing factions' views were similar, history would soon show that allegiance to the wrong party could prove fatal. As committee member of the Georgian Bolsheviks, Kober had been elected to serve as representative to a conference being held in 1905 in the aftermath of the failed 1905 revolution. There, Stalin met Lenin for the first time, marking the beginning of an enduring friendship and mentorship which Stalin would ride all the way to the top. Following this meeting, Kober became a devout follower of Lenin's teachings. And yet, though his love for Lenin quickly grew, he did not shy away from challenging the Bolshevik leader on matters which he disagreed with. This charismatic confidence as a politician, combined with Kober's ferocity as a guerrilla revolutionary, afforded him a fearsome reputation. In prison, Kober would organize other Bolsheviks and carry out the execution of those he suspected of being informants. Outside of prison, Kober and his gang, the Outfit, recklessly raised funds for the Bolshevik movement through kidnappings, armed robberies, and protection rackets. His natural inclination toward extreme violence put the young Kober at odds with the Mensheviks, as well as with Lenin at times. Yet he refused to change his ways. In 1912, a year before being exiled to the high Arctic, 3 things happened which would secure Kober a winning hand in the long-running game of Russian Revolution roulette, which the various socialist factions of Europe had been playing. Firstly, Kober wrote an article entitled Marxism and the National Question, which not only propelled him into the Bolshevik limelight, but which was also authored as Joseph K. Stalin, a name which he would come to be known by, and which in Russian translated to the Man of Steel. Secondly, Grigory Zinoviev and Vladimir Lenin, elected to the Bolsheviks' first Central Committee, brought Stalin on board as well. And thirdly, in February of the same year, Stalin was made editor-in-chief of the Bolshevik Party newspaper, Pravda. With the respect of the Bolsheviks, a place on the Central Committee, and control of the most powerful revolutionary propaganda machine the world had ever seen, Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator, was officially born. Wild card: Stalin as a military hero in the Russian Civil War. In October of 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully overthrew the majority liberal provincial government, which had been established by the February Revolution of the same year. In doing so, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin became the de facto rulers of a new socialist government, which Lenin christened the Council of People's Commissars. Almost immediately, the Russian Civil War broke out, with more parties and armies vying for power than you could possibly count. At the same time, the Bolsheviks pulled out of the First World War by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. Amidst the political turmoil of civil war, in which the newly empowered Bolsheviks were faced with the task of defeating enemies not only within their own country, but both internationally and within their own party, the first signs of Stalin's ruthless leadership tactics began to emerge. Despite once being hounded by the Okhrana, Stalin became an outspoken advocate for the Bolsheviks' own state secret police, the Cheka. He employed the Cheka freely, often encouraging them to sentence and execute anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities without even holding a trial. Stalin's wartime tactics were reckless and ruthless, and resulted in thousands of unnecessary deaths. He disobeyed direct orders and often acted like a petulant child when challenged, threatening to resign if reprimanded again. Nevertheless, Stalin emerged from the Russian Civil War, in which the Bolsheviks were ultimately victorious, as a war hero. His popularity in the Council of People's Commissars and throughout the Soviet-aligned states of Eastern Europe was at its highest to date, and Stalin was hungry for more. Death of a father, Lenin's death, and the consolidation of power. Lenin had mixed feelings towards Stalin. On one hand, he was a wonderful Georgian that in March 1922, Lenin nominated as the party's new general secretary. On the other, he was a crude and impulsive person who spoke out of turn and was beginning to accrue too much power. Indeed, Stalin was a shrewd politician and used his new role as general secretary to quietly and carefully build up a strong base of support in key positions throughout the party. At the same time, he cozied up to Lenin even more, being one of just two people, alongside Trotsky, who were allowed to enter Lenin's office in the Smolny Institute without an appointment. When Lenin suffered a massive stroke in May of 1922, the Bolshevik commander-in-chief became mostly confined to his holiday home, or dacha, in Moscow. Stalin, of course, used this to his advantage, establishing himself as Lenin's main point of contact to the Council of People's Commissars. Together, at Lenin's estate, the pair decided on the new name for Europe's alliance of socialist countries, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Finally, in January 1924, Lenin died. Stalin was quick to act. He organized Lenin's funeral, embalming, and internment in a mausoleum on Moscow's Red Square. In doing so, he intentionally established a personality cult around Lenin, which would, in time, form the framework for his own. Utilizing his intimate connections within the Cheka and using his role as General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party to surround himself with supporters, whilst removing opposition, Stalin spent the next 3 years consolidating power. By the time 1927 rolled around, Little So-So had established himself as the ultimate leader of the Bolshevik Party. Paranoia and politics. The erratic policies of Uncle Joe. Joe Stalin had ridden the coattails of his old comrade, Lenin, all the way to the top. Employing guile, aggression, and downright stubbornness, the shoemaker's son from Georgia was now in charge of one of the most powerful states in the world. But there was one problem. Russia was still heavily agricultural. In a 1931 statement, Stalin said, "We have fallen behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years. We must close that gap in 10 years. Either we do this, or we'll be crushed." Beginning as soon as he was in power, Stalin began dismantling Lenin's new economic policy, enforcing instead a renewed collectivization of agriculture, with grain procurement squads created to seize the peasants' harvests by force. When armed uprisings against collectivization peaked in 1930, they were violently suppressed by the Red Army. Joseph Stalin's governmental policies were often used ad hoc and without much foresight. They were designed to address short-term issues with the same flippancy he had employed when sending Red Army soldiers to their deaths during the Civil War. He also began to issue decidedly anti-socialist policies as a means of appealing to his more conservative, Russo-centric base. He recriminalized homosexuality, tore down churches, mosques, and synagogues, announced strict new abortion and divorce laws, and even abolished the Zenotdel, the women's department of the Bolshevik Central Committee. In 1928, Stalin announced the first of his 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize Russia. The plan was a success, and many new urban centers opened, alongside mines, factories, and the completion of the Moscow Metro and White Sea-Baltic Canal through forced labor. But Stalin's successes were to come with a hefty price. The Great Terror. Stalin becomes the most evil man in history. Stalin's first wife, the love of his life, Ekaterina Svanidze, died just 1 year after their marriage in 1906. At her funeral, the man then known as Koba said, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She has died, and with her have died my last warm feelings for humanity." That heart of stone was hardened further when, in 1929, his son Yakov attempted suicide, and when, in 1932, his second wife, Nadezhda, successfully committed suicide after a dinner party at which Stalin had humiliated her. Perhaps these tragedies go some way to explaining how a man who can speak so poetically at a funeral could go on to say this to US Ambassador Averell Harriman 30 or so years later. "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Following the first 5-year plan, which we just discussed, a disastrous famine claimed the lives of between 5 and 7 million people, mostly in southern Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the northern Caucasus. The famine had essentially been engineered, whether deliberately or not, by forced collectivization and the migration of millions of Soviet citizens from the fields to the cities. Indeed, some historians still argue that it was a calculated class genocide. Regardless, the horrors of famine were to be nothing compared to the reign of terror which Stalin was about to unleash on his party and his people. Uncle Joe watched on when, in 1934, the new German Chancellor Adolf Hitler purged his party during the infamous Night of the Long Knives. And though Stalin knew the threat which Nazism posed to his own regime, he nevertheless openly admired Hitler for how he dealt with internal opposition. By then, Stalin had already begun holding show trials as a means of purging counter-revolutionaries from the Union. But when prominent party member Sergei Kirov was assassinated in December 1934, his paranoia suddenly blossomed. He became increasingly concerned for his own safety and decided that more extreme measures were now necessary. Following Hitler's example, Stalin initiated the Great Terror, as it came to be known, in which he had the NKVD arrest 56% of his entire Congress and execute a third. The terror was meticulously documented and authorized by Stalin and Stalin alone, reaching its peak during the Great Purge of 1936 to 38. By the time World War II rolled around, Stalin had wiped out between 700,000 and 1.6 million of his own people. Now, no one in the Politburo would ever question Stalin again. They had been shown exactly what would happen to them if they did. World War II, Times 1942, Man of the Year. Stalin had initially hoped to keep Russia out of the war. In August 1939, Russia signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, declaring non-aggression between the two countries. Perhaps luckily for Stalin, this gave the Soviet Union a little extra time in which to recover from the devastations of the past decade. Of course, you should never trust a Nazi, for in June 1941, Hitler ordered his armies to invade the USSR. At first, his infamous Blitzkrieg tactic proved extraordinarily successful, and by July, the Nazis had pushed Soviet forces as far back as Moscow. Even in the midst of war, however, Stalin's ruthlessness toward his own people did not abate. During the retreat to Moscow, Stalin ordered the execution of over 100,000 political prisoners, held in camps which the Wehrmacht were able to capture. His evil even extended to his own family. When the Nazis took Stalin's son Yakov as prisoner, they tried to ransom him to the Soviets, but when Stalin heard of this, he simply replied, "I have no son by that name." Yakov died in a Nazi cell. The Soviets, though they had their backs against the wall, were not going to be pushed over so easily, however. The Russian army has often been likened to a steamroller. It takes a while to get going, and even longer to get up to full speed. But once it's there, nothing can stop it. This was the case during World War II, and after more than a year of bitterly entrenched fighting and siege warfare, the USSR began its counterattack. 3 years later, they would be the first Allied soldiers to set foot in Berlin. The immense power of the Red Army, combined with Stalin's unwillingness to give in, made him incredibly popular in the West. In 1941, the London Philharmonic Orchestra put on a special concert to celebrate Joe's birthday. And even more unbelievably, despite all of the atrocities the man had committed, in 1942, America's Time magazine named Stalin their Man of the Year. Death and legacy, villain and hero, communist and fascist, saint and sinner. Following Soviet victory in World War II, Stalin's health began to deteriorate. Though his life would soon draw to a close, however, he still had a few nasty tricks up his sleeve. For one, he ensured that 2.6 million of his returning soldiers were interrogated by the NKVD. Of these 2.8 million, around half were sent immediately to concentration camps in the Russian interior, where many would perish. As Stalin grew more ill, he grew more evil. He became suspicious and closed off to other communist leaders, such as Chairman Mao of China and Yugoslav's Tito. He abolished capital punishment and then reinstalled it. And when another awful famine hit in 1946 to 47, Stalin turned a blind eye. Yet, at the same time, he rebuilt the USSR's post-war economy stronger than ever before and brought Russia into the nuclear age with the atom bomb in 1949. Whilst to some he was the ultimate villain, to others he was a genuine hero. On the 5th of March, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel, Koba, Little So-So, died of a massive brain hemorrhage. Today, most of us remember Stalin as one of the most evil men in history. And yet, his story is not so clear-cut. For some, the tale of an impoverished, minority ethnic boy who had been abused, arrested, and exiled, and yet who had risen to the most powerful office in the world, remains one to be proud of. Stalin has ever been beatified as a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. Indeed, a poll conducted in Russia in 2021 showed that 70% of Russians believe Stalin to have played a positive role in their history, whilst another 39% of them counted Stalin as the most outstanding figure of all times and nations. Outstanding? Perhaps. Evil? The word evil barely even covers it. So there you have it, the life of Joseph Stalin. Do you also think he is the most evil man in history? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch my video on Grigory Rasputin. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.